Good afternoon. This is Chapter 12, Lecture C. This will conclude Chapter 12 lecture. We've been talking about abolitionism the last couple lectures, the reform movements. We started this week in Chapter 12 talking about the utopian societies in which they tried to reform society or exclude themselves. We talked about the Shakers who had no sex. Obviously, we know that didn't work out well for them. We talked about the other groups that were the men dominated. That didn't work out. And then we talked about the creation of the asylum, getting rid of crazy people in society or people that were rejected. And then we talked about the crusade against slavery and abolitionism and how there was the white and black versions of that. And then how people obviously objected to abolitionism. Now we're going to talk about the origins of the feminist movement. The rise of public women. Public sphere was open to women where they helped move petitions, delivered lectures, and raised money for causes. And they'll be active in the temperance movement as well. And this is something new. Women had typically been not allowed to be in the active role of the public sphere. They were usually reserved for the private sphere of home. But during this, you're going to start to see, especially during abolitionism and the use of women in other things, you're going to see women take a much more active role. Dorothy Dix helped create mental hospitals to get people out of prisons. And though the asylum itself was not great, they will create mental institutes like Dorothy Dix to get, just because they're men have issues, they shouldn't necessarily belong in prison. Women in free speech. Women who helped in the abolition movement began to understand their own subordinate social and legal status. Women's rights movement was born really at the same time as the slavery rights was born. Angelina and Sarah Gramick, daughters of a South Carolina slave owner, were converted to Quakerism and then to abolitionism while visiting Philadelphia. So these two Southern women, sisters, who had grown up as a product of slavery, came to Philadelphia and they were converted to abolitionism. They offered a scathing condemnation of slavery from their perspective, those who had witnessed evils firsthand, and obviously ones that had benefited from its fruits. The sisters also questioned women's status in society and the limitations they faced, because, even break it down a little bit more, those in the South, women were expected to play the role of the harlot, or not necessarily the harlot, but like the stay-at-home wife, subjective to the father's rule. So there was also a sense of paternalism. The father drove and dictated everything. Women's rights. The Gramick sisters were the first to apply the abolitionist doctrine of freedom and equality to the status of women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott organized the Seneca Falls Convention of 1848, and this is really the first movement towards women's rights and the pushing for suffrage. They raised the issue of suffrage specifically, but any men that took part in this are going to take a lot of heat. And those who helped it are going to obviously, they'll be ostracized a little bit, not necessarily kicked out, but like society, but they're going to get a lot of flack for supporting women. It'll take another 70 years to reach the right to vote, but this is born in that same period. Feminism and freedom was an international movement, more progress allies abroad, though women will get the right to vote quicker than the British women will. Margaret Fuller became a huge writer in the 1840s, and even became literary editor of the New York Times, first woman to do so, though I believe when she becomes the editor, it will be under a pseudonym as a masculine name. Died in a shipwreck in 1850 while returning to the United States. Unfortunately, that will be a short-lived accomplishment. But women and work, going to Origins of Feminism 3. Sojourner Truth, and insisted a movement devote attention to the plight of the poor and working class women. She was a former slave who had gained her freedom, but she said it wasn't just enough to devote to women's rights, but also look at the poor and the plight of the working class woman. Repudiate the idea that women were too delicate to engage in work outside the home. One thing, that point number 2 there, that often people thought was women were too delicate and would break if pushed too hard or worked too much. Now, I mean, obviously poor working class women worked long hours, but there was this idea that if we pushed women too far, it would hinder them or kill them. We'll have to pause for 1 second while I have a phone call. Yes, sir. I had They might need to remind me again, but Beth is going to try to get someone to cover for her because she's got a mentoring thing going on. But I had touch base with them. Bye. Sorry about that interruption, a phone call. But moving on back to point number 3 here. Once in a speech, she flexed her muscle from years of working as a slave and aren't I a woman enough? So Sojourner Truth will really fight to improve the relations of women in work. Slavery of sex. Women's rights groups began discussing the concept of slavery of sex, the restriction of women in marriage and what they could and couldn't do. Southerners believed if you did away with one of them, it would affect the other in a negative light. That really makes no sense. I have a question mark in there that says, huh? Women's rights began looking at women were really restricted in the marriage. If a woman had relations with another man outside of marriage or even before marriage, they would often be labeled a whore, harlot, etc. But if a man engaged in this, it was much more quieted. They weren't shunned. It was kind of expected behavior, I guess. But women, they make a mistake. They were shunned and often ostracized, and they were obviously still meant, especially in the South, meant to fill the needs of their husbands. Origin of Feminism 4, social freedom. The law of domestic relations proposed the husband's right of sexual access to his wife and inflict corporal punishment on her for he deemed necessary. Courts proved reluctant to intervene as long as the abuse was not extreme or intolerable. I'm sorry, I don't see how that would make any sense to hit a woman, but this was the law or the way it was viewed then. Women began to challenge the established norm. Ironically, the birth rate fell during the 1850s. Women will challenge in many different ways the whole concept of slavery of sex that we just talked about and start to challenge that and say they have a choice in the matter and that they're not there just to bear kids and be there for their enjoyment of their husband. But I think what's critical there is the birth rate does fall in the 1850s. So whether it be very subtly, women will fight back against their position there. Now, the origins of Feminism 5, we're going to now conclude this chapter with the abolitionist schism. Samuel Gridley Howe pioneered human treatment of the blind and educational reform and was ardent abolitionist, but he did not like his wife being involved with the suffrage movement. Caused her to neglect her domestic relations. The immediate cause of organized abolition in the 1840s was over the role of women in anti-slavery work. Women, thus as they do the anti-slavery work, initially were welcomed in, but they became so devoted to it that they also started to look at their own rights and say, wait, why don't you stop at slavery? Let's also look at women's rights. And that's going to greatly expand, and that's going to scare men to some degree, and some men are going to call their wives back home. Other groups also sprang up, but what you're looking at here is a reaction to a reaction. So the reaction to in slavery is going to have a reaction of feminism. The reaction by men was, oh, well, let's don't go too far here. Let's kind of calm it down a little bit. Part of the split in the abolitionist movement was over that. And the other part was Garrison's radicalism, an issue like women's rights, and the refusal to have people run office or influence parties. One thing the abolitionists like Garrison didn't advocate was people running for political office to change stuff with law. This, they believed, impeded the movement's growth, which it's true. I mean, it took constitutional amendments to really change anything dealing with slavery. In conclusion, women's rights became a central discussion as well as did abolitionism. Abolition will continue to grow, but women's rights will not be fully forgotten or left behind. It'll take them longer, but you see now a change in the country. So as we finish chapter 12 here, you're starting to see some changes, some different thoughts starting to emerge and challenges to the status quo. So that's going to end this chapter. And as we get into the next chapter, 13, we will really dive into the 1840s and 50s, looking at the political movements, and it's titled A House Divided, and you'll see the full-on leading up to the Civil War.